Good morning and welcome back to Dr. Logic awkwardly rants more about the proper interpretation of Indian logic. Now, last video I highlighted the fact that when Henry Colebrook presented this material from the Nyaya Sutras to the Royal Asiatic Society, he translated the word Nyaya as syllogism. So he talked about the Indian syllogism. Now, I've already gone and written this up on that five-step argument that he talked about on my whiteboard so that I don't have to spend the time to do it now. So it's got these components. This hill is fiery, for it smokes. What smokes is fiery. Oops, I forgot the bit that says, like a kitchen hearth. Accordingly, the hill is smoky, therefore it is fiery. Now, take the description syllogism at face value. If you do so, then this is not a good syllogism. It's not a good syllogism, first, on formal grounds. It has 5 steps. We made it very clear that syllogisms have 3 propositions, 2 premises, 1 conclusion. There are simply too many things going on in this 5-step version of the argument for it to count as a syllogism. Also, it has its conclusion first. This is not how syllogisms are. You write the major premise, then the minor premise, and then the conclusion. And yet, line 1 and line 5 are the same. Now, you might be able to say, okay, let's kind of squeeze this into a syllogism. We can do that. So we could get something like this. All that is smoky is fiery. This hill is smoky. This hill is fiery. Now, interestingly, in Ganeri's chapter that I quoted from in the previous one, he says that this is an instance of Barbara. Well, that depends on how you take definite statements like this hill. Now, in the syllogism that we developed, we can't actually have kind of definite terms like that. So we would have to make it into either something like everything that is identical to this hill is smoky, in which case this would end up being a version of Barbara. Or we could just say kind of more generically, some hill is smoky, therefore some hill is fiery, and that would be Dari. This gets combined along with a second kind of paired up syllogism. Nothing that is non-fiery is smoky. This hill is smoky, therefore this hill is not non-fiery, i.e. it is fiery. So here you've got kind of both the positive and the negative aspect. So you could take this and translate it into these 2 syllogisms, modulo some of the kind of complaints that I made about the use of phrases like this hill. But if you do that, it's hard to come away from the conclusion that if this were intended to be a syllogism, it's not a very good one. It's defective formally. It has too many statements. It's not in the right order. When we try to translate it into something that looks more like a syllogism, first of all, we go from 1 to 2, and then we have this, there's a lot of problems trying to interpret this as a syllogism. So one consequence of Colebrook using this word, and then people trying to say, okay, if this is a syllogism, what kind of syllogism, is that people were still able to kind of cling to their belief in this kind of Western cultural superiority by saying, oh, well, they tried to develop syllogisms, but they failed. They didn't do a very good job. Now, I hope that every single one of you watching these videos complains immediately about that sort of response. So just because you can show that it can be translated into a bad syllogism A doesn't mean that it was intended to be a syllogism. B doesn't mean that it couldn't be translated into something more sophisticated with a different approach to logic. C doesn't mean that this is even something we should be doing in the first place. Should we even be trying to translate this into something that conforms to our Western logical foundations, definitions, things like that? So a couple other things I want to say is that other people recognized that this pattern of reasoning, that if you try to translate the five-step argument into the syllogisms, you get a bad syllogisms. Therefore, if it was intended to be a syllogism, Indian logic was just bad syllogistics. Once you develop a more nuanced account of what logic can be, and in the history of kind of Western developments of logic, this came with a broadening of logic to include more than just the syllogistic in doing kind of symbolic representation. So by the time that we get to the early 20th century and we have predicate logic, then there's actually the question of, well, maybe the problem was that we tried to represent it with the syllogistic and that didn't work. Let's try representing it in predicate logic. So this is something that a guy called Scheer tried to do. So he gave an alternative characterization of the five-step argument via predicate logic. So what we'll do is just kind of rewrite each of these steps. In the first case, we can say, okay, the thesis is the statement FA, where F is fiery and A is this particular mountain that we are interested in. The reason is because GA, there is smoke on A, or it is smoky. And then we have a statement of pervasion that says, for everything, if it is smoky, then it is fiery. Take that and make it specific to this particular mountain. So this mountain is smoky, therefore, if this mountain is smoky, then this mountain is fiery. And then conclude our conclusion again. So this is our reason, or our hetu. This is our statement of pervasion. This application step, which we didn't have in our original three-step form, is basically just universal elimination. And then what we have between our application and our reason, we've got conditional elimination, lines 2 and 4. And then this just is kind of the statement of our conclusion again. Now, this seems much better. This seems to capture a lot of the ways in which the syllogism didn't work. So one thing that we've got here is we can put everything still in the same order. So the fact that we have to kind of move the order of things around is no longer an objection. And this has the sense of kind of talking about the right things. So we are talking about objects, and we're talking about the properties that they have, and we're talking about this sort of inference. Now, there are still some issues here with this. In particular, we still have the problem of, why do we have the statement of our thesis first? If this is to be taken as the conclusion of our argument, well, what is it being based on? If we are taking it as a premise of one of our arguments, then this is just begging the question. It doesn't actually tell us anything more than we already had. We just asserted our conclusion at the very beginning. So there was an alternative idea that was also kind of put forward, which is that this five-step argument form isn't necessarily about kind of valid structures in terms of either the syllogistic or predicate logic, but rather it is about the, a dialectical structure. So the way that we should understand this is kind of a back and forth between the person who's trying to show this and some sort of interlocutor. So each one of these can be thought of as an answer to some question. So, what is your thesis? What are you trying to prove? Answer: this hill has fire on it. Why? Why do you think that is the case? Because it has smoke on it. So what? Why is what is the relationship between these two things? Well, where there is smoke, there is fire, like in a kitchen. And what's the relevance of this general claim that you made? Well, the hill is a smoky place. So why do I care if the hill smokes? Well, therefore, it has fire. So this allows this kind of dialectical understanding, helps us to make sense of what each of these steps are and why they are coming in the order that they're doing. So what is your thesis? Why do you think it's true? So what? What's kind of the import of that reason? And so each one of these steps provides the person arguing for the conclusion with a chance to kind of give one more piece of evidence. So this is a very different approach to what logic is and what it is for. And this goes back to kind of this idea that what we are interested in is providing reasons for believing in things rather than providing for this kind of general characterization of abstract validity. So this 5-step argument form only really makes sense in a context where I am trying to share my reasons with somebody else. And that is what is happening at this epistemic level of logic. So I just wanted to say a little bit about kind of this consequences of calling this 5-step argument form or the 3-step argument form that we talked about with Vasubandhu and Dignaga, and calling it a syllogism. Well, if you think this is a syllogism, it turns out to be a bad one. And so you can kind of come away from this thinking it's like, oh, they tried to do syllogisms, they didn't do very good. Don't worry, we're still intellectually superior to everybody else. No, that's not the way you want to do it. You want to say, okay, well, let's take what they are doing on their own grounds, and take it for what it is. Don't try to shoehorn it into what we're trying to do, because we're trying to do different things. So it's not surprising that they don't end up working. If I have developed something for reason A, for action A, and you've developed something for action B, then taking the tool that you've made for B and trying to use it for my A, why would I expect this to work? Anyway, there's a lot more that can be said about kind of the interpretation of these types of arguments and the best way to understand them that doesn't rely on shoehorning them into Western styles of logic. And I will probably do one more video on that to talk about the what can be called the property location interpretation of Indian logic. So instead of talking about objects and properties, we're going to talk about properties and locations of properties. So not quite the same sort of thing. So that, as I said, we'll probably talk about that in another video. But I just want to kind of stress this idea that we shouldn't judge this approach to reasoning against standards that it wasn't constructed to apply to. Instead, we should ask ourselves, what did Indian philosophers and theologians and theorists want to use this type of reasoning for? And then we can ask ourselves, does it do a good job of doing that or not, independently of whether or not we can shoehorn it into predicate logic or the syllogistic. Notice I didn't even try to do it into propositional logic. It would have been immediately obvious that that was not the way to go. So, I don't know. If I say anything more, I'll just end up repeating myself. The take-home message is evaluate this on its own merits, not according to how well you can shoehorn it into predicate logic or something like that. I guess that's all I have to say in this rant. Join me next time. I'm sure I'll find something more to rant about. Take care. Cheers.